After studying this module, you shall be able to know the different kinds of material variances, labor variances and overhead variances, identify the subcomponents of material variances, categorize the labor variances, understand the fact that overhead cost variance includes fixed cost variance and variable cost variance. The variance results when there is a difference between the standard cost allowed and the actual cost incurred. We should understand the kinds of variances before doing the computation work related to it. The total cost variance, standard cost minus actual cost, is divided into variance for each element of cost, that is material cost variance, labor cost variance and overhead cost variance, which are further bifurcated into various subcomponents. Let us begin our discussion on direct material variance. The variance arising with respect to the component material constitutes material variance. The variance may arise as a result of the difference between the actual price paid and standard price expected, actual units produced from material and the standard expected, actual mix of material and the standard mix, etc. The different types of material variances are discussed below. First, material cost variance is the difference between the standard cost of material allowed for the actual output achieved and the actual cost of material used. It is favorable when the actual cost of material is less than the standard cost of material for actual output and adverse when actual cost is higher than the standard cost. Material cost variance can be further subdivided into material price variance and material usage quantity variance. Second, material price variance arises when the firm purchases the raw material at a price different than the standard price. Third, material usage variance arises when there is a difference between the actual quantities of raw material and standard quantities of raw material to produce the output achieved. The material usage variance is subdivided into material mix variance and material revised usage variance or material sub-usage variance. Fourth, material mix variance may arise in a situation where the firm uses different proportion mix of raw materials to produce the finished product. The firm predetermines the standard mix to be used for production, but its actual mix may differ than expected because of many reasons like price rise in the cost of material, delay in purchasing the material, etc. Fifth, material revised usage variance takes into account those reasons other than those of material mix variance that attributes to material usage variance. It undertakes the difference between the standard quantity and revised standard quantity. When there is no difference between the total actual quantities of all material and total standard quantities of all the material, then the revised standard quantity would be same as standard quantity, resulting into no material revised usage variance. Sixth, material yield variance measures the difference in actual output yield for a given set of inputs and the standard output yield for a given set of inputs. Let us now discuss what is direct labor variances. The term labor variance denotes variance with respect to the labor, and it arises when there is a difference between the actual labor cost and standard labor cost. The different kinds of labor variances are discussed in this section. Labor cost variance is the difference between the standard cost of labor allowed for the actual output achieved and the actual cost of labor used. It can be further subdivided into labor rate variance and labor time efficiency variance. Labor rate variance arises when the firm pays the wages at a rate different than the standard wage rate. Labor efficiency variance is that part of the labor cost variance which is due to the difference between the actual labor hours and standard labor hours specified to produce the output achieved. The labor efficiency time variance is subdivided into idle time variance, labor mix variance and labor sub-efficiency variance. Idle time means the workers are not able to utilize the total time for which they are paid for and sitting idle for some time. Labor mix variance may arise in a situation where the firm uses different proportion mix of labor to produce the finished product. Labor revised efficiency variance arises because of the reasons other than those belongs to idle time variance and labor mix variance that attributes to labor usage variance. This variance takes into account those reasons and undertakes the difference between the standard hours and revised standard hours. The labor yield variance is just like material yield variance. The labor yield variance measures the difference in actual output yield for a given set of labor inputs and the standard output yield for a given set of labor inputs. Direct labor rate variance. Actual quantity into standard rate less actual quantity into actual rate. Let us understand this concept with the help of an example. And sale of hand stitched jeans trousers. The company manufactured and sold 1000 pairs of jeans during a period. Information relating to the direct labor cost and production time per unit is as follows. The labor rate variance shall be calculated as follows. Step 1. Calculate actual hours. Actual hours is equal to 10,000 units into actual price is equal to 5,000 hours. Step 2. Calculate the actual cost. Actual cost is equal to actual hours into actual rate. 5,000 hours calculated in step 1 multiplied by rupees 12 per hour equal to 60,000 rupees. Step 3. Calculate the standard cost of actual number of hours. Standard cost of actual hours is equal to actual hours into standard rate. 5,000 hours calculated in step 1 multiplied by rupees 10 per hour equal to 50,000 rupees. Step 4. Calculate the variance. Labor rate variance is equal to actual cost less standard cost of the actual hours, which is equal to 60,000 rupees calculated in step 2 minus 50,000 rupees calculated in step 3 is equal to rupees 10,000 adverse. Let us understand what is the relevance of this analysis. A favorable labor rate variance suggests cost efficient employment of direct labor by the organization. Reasons for a favorable labor rate variance may include: first, hiring of more unskilled or semi-skilled labor. This may adversely impact labor efficiency variance. Second, decrease in the overall wage rates in the market due to an increase in the supply of labor which may be caused, for example, due to the influx of migrants as a result of the relaxation of immigration policy. Third, inappropriately high setting of the standard cost of direct labor which may in the hindsight be attributed to inaccurate planning. An adverse labor rate variance indicates higher labor cost incurred during a period compared with the standard. Causes for adverse labor rate variance may include: first, increase in the national minimum wage rate. Second, hiring of more skilled labor than anticipated in the standard. this should be reflected in a favorable labor efficiency variance. Third, inefficient hiring by the HR department. Fourth, effective negotiations by labor unions. Let us now understand overhead variances. The total overhead cost variance results whenever there is a difference between the actual overhead cost incurred and the standard overhead cost for the actual output achieved. Overhead cost variance is divided into fixed overhead variance and variable overhead variance. This section discusses variable overhead variances and fixed overhead variances. Variable overhead cost variance measures the difference between absorbed variable overhead and actual variable overhead. The variable overhead cost variance is subdivided into variable overhead expenditure, spending, budget variance and variable overhead efficiency variance. Variable overhead expenditure, spending, budget variance arise when there is a difference between standard variable overhead and actual variable overhead incurred. Variable overhead efficiency variance arises when there is a difference between absorbed variable overhead and standard variable overhead. Example of variable overhead spending variance. The cost accounting staff of a company calculates based on historical and projected cost patterns that the company should experience a variable overhead rate of rupees 20 per labor hour worked and builds this figure into the budget. In April, the actual variable overhead rate turns out to be rupees 22 per labor hour. During that month, production employees work 18,000 hours. The variable overhead spending variance is A. 18,000 actual hours worked into rupees 22 actual variable overhead rate minus rupees 20 standard overhead rate is equal to rupees 36,000 variable overhead spending variance. Let us now discuss the fixed overhead variances. Fixed overhead cost variance FOCV is that portion of total overhead cost variance that arises due to difference between standard fixed overhead cost for actual output and actual fixed overhead. It is divided into two variances, that is, first, fixed overhead expenditure variance and second, fixed overhead volume variance. Fixed overhead expenditure spending budget variance is that portion of fixed overhead cost variance which arises due to the difference between budgeted fixed overhead and actual fixed overhead. Fixed overhead volume variance is that portion of fixed overhead cost variance which arises due to the difference between standard cost of overhead absorbed by actual production and the budgeted overhead. Fixed overhead volume variance is subdivided into efficiency variance, capacity variance and calendar variance. Fixed overhead efficiency variance is that portion of fixed overhead volume variance that arises due to the difference between the actual output and the standard output expected, arising from the efficiency of workers or plant. Fixed overhead capacity variance is that portion of fixed overhead volume variance that arises due to difference in standard and actual output because of under and over capacity utilization of plant and equipment attributing to factors like idle time, lockouts and strikes, material shortage, machinery breakdown, labor turnover. Fixed overhead calendar variance arises when there is a difference between the number of working days in the budgeted period and actual number of working days to which the budget is applicable. Let us understand this concept with the help of an example. A manufacturing company involved in the production of automobiles. Information from its last budget period is as follows. Actual production 2,75,000 units. Budgeted production 2,50,000 units, actual fixed production overheads 52 crore 60 lakh rupees. Budgeted fixed production overheads 50 crore rupees. We now have to calculate the fixed overhead volume variance and fixed overhead expenditure variance. The fixed overhead expenditure variance can be calculated as actual production, which is 52 crore 60 lakhs less budgeted fixed overhead, which is 50 crores, which gives us the variance 2 crores 60 lakhs rupees adverse. The variance is adverse because the company PLC incurred greater expense than provided for in the budget. The fixed overhead volume variance can be calculated as budgeted production of rupees 50 crores less absorbed fixed overhead, which is rupees 55 crores, which gives us the variance 5 crores rupees favorable. The variance is favorable because the company yielded a higher output than anticipated in the budget. Let us proof check this. The sum of fixed overhead expenditure and volume variance should equal to the fixed overhead total variance as calculated in above. Fixed overhead expenditure, which is rupees 2 crores 60 lakhs adverse, less fixed overhead volume variance, which is 5 crores rupees variable variance, gives us total of 2 crores 40,000 adverse. This is the fixed overhead, which is rupees 2 crores 40 lakhs total variance. The variance is favorable because the company yielded a higher output than anticipated in the budget. Let us summarize. The variance results when there is a difference between the standard cost allowed and the actual cost incurred. The total cost variance standard cost less actual cost is divided into variance for each element of cost, that is material cost variance, labor cost variance and overhead and overhead cost variance, which are further bifurcated between various subcomponents. The variance arising with respect to the component material constitutes material variance. Material cost variance is the difference between the standard cost of material allowed for the actual output achieved and the actual cost of material used. Material cost variance can be further subdivided into material price variance and material usage quantity variance. The material usage variance is subdivided into material mix variance and material revised usage variance or material sub-usage variance. The term labor variance denotes variance with respect to the labor, and it arises when there is a difference between the actual labor cost and standard labor cost. Labor cost variance is the difference between the standard cost of labor allowed for the actual output achieved and the actual cost of labor used. Labor cost variance can be further subdivided into labor rate variance and labor time efficiency variance. The labor efficiency time variance is subdivided into idle time variance, labor mix variance and labor sub-efficiency variance. The total overhead cost variance results whenever there is a difference between the actual overhead cost incurred and the standard overhead cost for the actual output achieved. Overhead cost variance is divided into fixed overhead variance and variable overhead variance.